We're joined today by Ken Girardin. He's a fellow at the Manhattan Institute. Ken, thank you so much for taking the time. We appreciate it.
Good to be here.
All right, so let's begin with the New York City mayoral race and Zohran Mamdani winning, putting forth proposals in terms of policies that obviously resonated with voters. They voted for him as opposed to Andrew Cuomo or Curtis Sliwa. When it comes to his proposals policy-wise, and you look at the fiscal stability of the city and beyond, what sticks out to you first and foremost when it comes to him trying to implement this stuff?
Two big things. This was the biggest set of promises any candidate has ever made running for mayor. Mayor Elect Mamdani said from the onset he'd need $9 billion in tax increases, which is a really big deal, to achieve the things set out in his platform. The actual price tag is likely far higher, but it really stands head and shoulders above all other proposals that we've seen somebody running for mayor with. So that's one part. Then there's the question of the ability to have Albany go along with giving the city permission to do this stuff, and the overall fiscal prudence of doing these things. New York relies, and this is both at the city level and the state level, a lot on really volatile income from personal income taxes. We've seen before, particularly between 2007 and 2009, that capital gains, which is a big part of those income taxes, those can essentially evaporate in fairly short order. We saw them fall 75% during the Great Recession on an annualized basis. And that was something that put both the city and the state in really tough fiscal situations. We are vulnerable to have that happen again anytime. So you have to be really careful when you're promising to put new programs out there. On top of all of this, the city budgets over the past 3 budget cycles have spent more than they have taken in. And they've been able to do that because the city had some rolling surpluses, essentially. But there are going to be limits to how many times you can do that. And if you are making big plans to spend a lot of new money without being able to necessarily raise taxes enough to cover that, and risking tax base erosion in the course of doing it, and having to do it on top of essentially a fairly shaky foundation where the budget isn't technically balanced, that's going to be pretty hard.
But you mentioned the budget and you said vulnerable to repeating potentially the end of 2000s there. What are the factors? Why is that? Is that what you were just alluding to there?
The city is very reliant. The city gets about 40% of its personal income tax receipts from about 1% of tax filers. And these are folks whose income can be extremely volatile. A lot of this is Wall Street bonuses, capital gains, income that are related to Wall Street activity. And if Wall Street's having good years, then you see growth in those incomes, but you can also see very rapid shrinkages.
The state's role in all of this. I mean, I remember I sat here with the comptroller a few months ago asking about Zohran Mamdani, and we've heard other state leaders say, well, he's only going to be able to get so much through because of us, right, here in Albany. What, for you, how big of the factor is the state in him trying to implement this? How much of a percentage of the weight do they have here?
If we were going to look just at the $10 billion in new revenues that Mamdani is counting on, 90% of that requires permission from the state in terms of increasing the taxes either on businesses or individuals. So start with that. There are some things where the state might be willing to give the city extra money. The state's ability to do that is going to be somewhat constrained. Look back at what happened with Bill de Blasio, where he ran on a platform of providing universal pre-K, which at the time was seen as one of the biggest expansions of city government in history. In retrospect, it was fairly small compared to what Mamdani is doing by an order of magnitude. But you could have the state say, we will give some money towards one of these major proposals. For instance, the universal pre-K, the universal child care proposal. But that is really dependent on the state's overall fiscal health. And the state is even more reliant on volatile income than the city, because the state in 2021 created new tax rates that kick in at the $5 million and $25 million mark. And those are even more volatile than the city's income tax schedule.
Well, it feels like, we've had so many conversations about the federal government, federal funding, the state looking to potentially trim the budget. I'll first ask you about that. Do you think there's a real appetite for that with this conversation in mind, to trim a budget that also now New York City is going to be asking for? That's a lot of money moving around, right? Or a lack of money moving around.
The starting point for all conversations about the state budget are, or the starting point should be, is what the state is doing now sustainable? And it absolutely isn't. The state increased spending at roughly 3 times the rate of inflation in the budget that was adopted last spring. State spending in real terms is almost 20% higher than it was before COVID. And by real terms, I mean adjusting for inflation. The state really had this deluge of unexpected money as tax receipts came in higher than expected. And Albany has been treating that as the new normal rather than something that is likely a temporary phenomenon. So as things eventually get back to what we would consider normal, there's a real danger that the state is making bigger promises than it can finance.
Where do you see what could potentially the state look for in revenue that's not volatile then?
The most stable source of income that state government has is the sales tax. We watch that essentially move with inflation. Outside of recessionary conditions, we've seen it essentially track with inflation. The place where the state has had more money coming in than expected has been in corporate taxes on corporate income and personal income, particularly among high earners. And that's where you get into the danger about volatility, where that money could be there one quarter and not there the next quarter.
Say the state had the money to be able to do this. Do you think it could still work to be able to fulfill his policies, his promises? Do you think at the end of the day it would accomplish what he's hoping to accomplish?
Well, let's start with the first really big problem is we haven't seen a price tag on what Mamdani has proposed. That $9 billion tax increase figure was part of the campaign almost as a virtuous feature unto itself rather than a means to an end. It was, we're going to go get $9 billion and it's going to be great because we're going to tax the rich. And that was a goal unto itself. The actual price tag of implementing his agenda could easily be double the $9 billion that's been talked about. There's a proposal to do an extra $70 billion in spending on housing over a 10-year period. That comes with pretty significant debt costs. And it's not something that becomes a problem in the first 6 or 12 months, but it's something where you have to look at it together, where you're promising. Let's tabulate here: universal free childcare, for which the campaign has not put on a price tag, but it could. I've seen estimates that go into the tens of billions of dollars per year just for that, if it's implemented statewide, obviously. Free CUNY. Right now, the City University of New York collects about $800 million a year in tuition. So you'd be foregoing that, and you'd have the additional cost of providing the service for free as opposed to charging. You have the free buses, which isn't just about waiving the fares that are collected now, but also promising increased service, more faster lanes, better new and better signaling equipment. You could be looking easily at over $1 billion per year in costs there. You've got the big housing proposal, a number of other smaller ones. The grocery store proposal, by the way, it's not even worth mentioning. Frankly, it's been a really big distraction. It's a rounding error in the grand scheme of things. But you've got all these proposals where the costs haven't been tabulated. And that's a common problem in Albany that we're seeing percolate into local government now, where people are able to make these pie-in-the-sky proposals in the Senate and the Assembly, and you look down the bill memo to the fiscal implications, and it says TBD, which might as well stand for $10 billion in a lot of cases. But it's really problematic that you have people making these massive promises without going through the trouble of giving at least a ballpark cost proposal.
What's come with the promises is also, like you said, the beginning of that was to tax the rich. To you, and we've heard, I think the governor was down at Somos and they're chanting at her again yesterday. What does that mean to you, tax the rich? And how does that factor into this conversation?
This is going to come to a real shock to listeners, but New York already taxes the rich.
That's what the comptroller said that when I asked him the same question. Yep.
The far right comptroller of New York State, Tom DiNapoli. Yes, this is not some extremist conspiracy to let people in on the fact that yes, New York already taxes the rich. New York already gets roughly 50% of its personal income tax receipts from the top 1% of earners. New York City residents pay the highest combined state and local income tax rate in the country. So you're already taxing the rich significantly, and you're doing it on top of, like I was saying before, these really volatile securities related tax receipts. It's not just, I'd compare it to some of the states that are really reliant on oil income or natural gas or royalties from taxing natural gas and oil, where those are commodities where the prices can fall precipitously. And with it, so can the state tax receipts. The same thing happens when you're taxing Wall Street and the securities industry. So that's a really big danger. So the first thing that has to happen is people have to cast that belief out of their minds because the evidence points in an entirely different direction.
So they should be saying tax the rich more.
Yes, yes. To put it really delicately, they should be if they were going to be making an intellectually honest claim, which I'd like to assume extends to other things that they're calling for. We'll be charitable here. They would be saying tax the rich more, or tax the rich even more than the most amount that we already tax.
What does that look like if that's in the air?
If they were to go for it, you would definitely see more tax base erosion than we already have. There's a growing body of evidence that as New York has increased taxes since 2009, that you have seen more people either moving out of state or shifting their income out of state. If you are already somebody who has multiple residences, one in New York and one in Florida, it's fairly easy to change your full-time domicile to that lower tax locale and limit your time in New York. If you keep your time in New York below half the year, you can only be taxed on, on the business activity that you're doing while you're living in New York at that time. And you don't have to worry about having your capital gains get taxed in New York. So what we've seen is growth in the percentage of people who are being taxed in these very high brackets as non-residents or part-time residents because they're moving away. And we've seen a shrinkage in the percentage of income millionaires, people making over $1 million a year nationally, residing in New York. It used to be that New York had a really outsized share, and that the percentage of income millionaires living in New York has ticked down pretty consistently over time.
Final question in all this is the threats from Donald Trump to withhold funding for New York City. Do you see that? I mean, if that happens, then what is the question?
The federal government's appropriation powers are appropriately given to Congress, and money that has been, that would otherwise be directed to New York should go to New York, as in we should be following the law. I don't think there's a huge danger of any radical change happening from the executive branch simply because we have a functioning judiciary, and New York would be first in line to file a lawsuit if there were any inappropriate disruption there. There is discretionary money on the periphery, and I'd make the argument that this is a perfect example for reducing the amount of discretion that we give the executive branch simply because you don't want personal conflicts at the presidential level deciding how money is being spent. If the politics of a mayor are going to decide where the money is going, then Congress shouldn't have crafted that program that way in the first place.
Ken Girardin, thanks so much for your time. Appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.